Peace, family. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to Night School. Every night here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel, I hold Night School, where I break down the most urgent conversations, the most interesting debates, the most controversial topics going on in the world today. We don't do superficial cable news analysis. We don't do drive-by talking points. We have an intellectual deep dive on the issues that matter. And tonight is no exception. In fact, in some ways, tonight is an exception because we're talking about Israel's war on Gaza, what easily and absolutely should be called the genocide in Gaza 1 year later. As you know, here on the channel, we've done the War on Gaza report every single night just about. And when we do, we've remarked on how it's been a month and 2 months and 6 months and 9 months. And at each stage, we seem, or at least I felt, a bit shocked at how long this war has gone on. And now we have reached yet another tragic milestone. And that tragic milestone, of course, is the 1 year mark. So here tonight, I wanted to take an opportunity to have, again, a rich, thoughtful conversation about where we are, how we got here, and what things look like moving forward. And we're going to be joined by two incredible guests. We have, of course, the writer, the activist, the organizer, Susan Abulhawa. And we also have the brilliant scholar, the preeminent political historian of Gaza, in my estimation, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. They're both joining us. Susan's having a tech issue where she's going to jump right in a second, but I wanted to start right away with Professor Finkelstein. Good to see you, sir. I wish we were meeting to talk about the end of this military incursion rather than a 1 year milestone. What do you make of where we are at this juncture?
I think that for me is a tough question. Where we are right now, I would say when the assault on Gaza began October 8th, Israel had one overall aim. It wanted to put an end to the Gaza question. It had gone on too long. It had become periodically a pinprick at Israel's side. And everybody knows the cliche that a crisis is also an opportunity. And when October 7th happened, of course, there was a lot of genuine outrage, genuine indignation. That genuine outrage and indignation was compounded by the fact that it was these Gazan Untermenschen subhumans who had outsmarted, outwitted the Israeli Übermenschen, the Israeli supermen, and also had dared to inflict death, destruction, and injury on a large number of Israelis. As best we can tell now, 313 Israeli combatants and somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 plus Israeli civilians. So Israel was resolved to solve the Gaza question once and for all. And that, if we can use the expression final solution, took basically three forms. They overlapped in real life, but basically it took the form of 1, ethnic cleansing, 2, making Gaza unlivable, and 3, mass murder and destruction. Where we stand right now is, if you say those were Israel's 3 overlapping but still discrete goals, the estimates are about up to 200,000 Gazans have been expelled at this point or have fled. At this point, they had the money, the connections to get out. So that's about bringing us down to 2.1 million Gazans who are still trapped in that concentration camp. About the estimates are at this point about 50,000 Gazans have been killed. It's likely, but nobody can say how many more. The final tally will be much higher for many reasons, not least because most of the deaths, not all of them, but most of them have been tallied in hospitals. And because so many hospitals were destroyed, the deaths weren't tallied because nobody could reach the hospitals. So that's the second. And then the third uh, tactic to solve the Gaza question was to make it unlivable. And I would say there Israel had its biggest success, if we can use that term. It's destroyed about 50% of Gaza's infrastructure. There are about 45 million tons of rubble in Gaza. It'll take about 10 to 15 years to just to clear out the rubble. It's almost certain that Israel will use the pretext that Hamas uses cement to create its tunnel network. It will use that pretext to bar the entry of cement into Gaza. And so it's, I think, correct to say that in large regards, Gaza is no more and will not be more because of the massive destruction that's been inflicted on Gaza. I think the biggest misnomer or misrepresentation or disinformation about Gaza, which I notice you avoided that misrepresentation, is to describe what happened the past year as a war. It is not a war. Today, the New York Times, surprisingly, on its front page, an article by Marc Lamont, who's just, a typical Times hack. But he had an article which vividly described the civilian population, which is being systematically, methodically targeted by Israel. They have nowhere to flee, nowhere to go. They're trapped. And he describes all that. So far, so good, in the sense that it's an accurate depiction of the situation. But then he uses the phrase, all of this death, all of this destruction, all of it is to quote, root out Hamas. But that's just a flat out lie. Hamas is completely incidental to the process that began to unfold on October 8th, approximately 1 year ago. The goal was not to root out Hamas. The objective was to root out the population of Gaza, the soil from which Hamas or any resistance group in those circumstances would have emerged.
No, let me pause you there for a minute. You've said a few things that I know some people in the audience are going to want more insight on. The first thing is this question of war. Obviously, I agree that this is absolutely not.
It's not just that it's not a war.
But can you explain why it's not a war? Because there are people who are going to say this meets.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Because in a war, your objective is to inflict a military defeat on your enemy with the emphasis on military. You are targeting combatants. You are targeting what are called military objects, be it tanks, be it any object that serves a military purpose or end. However, if it's a genocide, you are not trying to achieve a military victory. You're trying to physically destroy the population. Your target, so to speak, is not combatants and military objects. Your target is civilians and civilian objects. It's a genocide. So, to give one concrete illustration, the greatest historian of the Nazi Holocaust was a person named Raoul Hilberg. And he wrote the first scholarly, serious study of the subject. And it was very notable what he titled his scholarly inquiry. He did not title it The War Against the Jews or The War Against European Jewry. He titled it The Destruction of European Jewry. And I remember my late mother, who passed through the Nazi Holocaust, she would recoil in indignation when anyone described what she endured as a war. And she would say, as I said, in outrage and indignation, she said, it wasn't a war. It was an extermination. She said we were like cockroaches. The light would be shined on us. We would then, like a cockroach, flee to the left or flee to the right. Then the light would be shined on us again, and we would flee and we would flee. And if you read the descriptions of what's happening in Gaza, the flight to the left, the flight to the right, the flight forward, the flight backwards, and wherever you flee, the Israelis drop the bombs again. They direct you to the refugee center, the supposed refugee centers, and when you reach them, bombs away again, and bombs away again. That's not a war. Even if, let's say for argument's sake, even if they were using the terrorism tactic in order to break the morale of the people in Gaza. For example, like the United States and Great Britain during World War II, as well as the Germans. They engaged in massive, what was called, terror bombing. They bombed the cities in order, they believed, to break the will of the Nazi regime. But still, when they used terror tactics, the goal, the objective was a military one, to militarily defeat the Nazis. That is entirely different than, say, the goal of the Nazis regarding the Jews. They didn't want to militarily defeat them. They wanted, as Raoul Hilberg titled his book, their objective was the destruction of the European Jews.
And we're seeing the same thing here. I want to bring
same thing.
I want to bring in Susan Abulhawa.
I'm just going to say, after October 8th, the aim was to once and for all solve the Gaza question.
That is absolutely the case. Susan, welcome to the show, and thank you for doing this. I know this is an impossibly difficult day, as all the past 365 days have been, on top of the last 100 years. I'm watching all day commemorations, news reports in corporate mainstream media, and I'm hearing, as Norm and I were just talking about, them calling it a war against Hamas or a war with Hamas. I'm hearing this being a commemoration day of tragedy in Israel with no sort of sense of what this has meant to the Palestinian people. I've seen these gross misrepresentations of what's happened over the last year at the same time that we're beginning to see yet another imperial genocidal intervention in Lebanon. How are you making sense of this moment? How are you thinking about this past year? Susan, let me see. I think you're muted. 1 second. There we go.
Sorry. Hi, Norm. Hi, Mark. I agree with what Norm said. It's absolutely not a war, and it was interesting to hear Norm used the cockroach analogy, because when I was in Gaza, I kept thinking about this quote by Raphael Itan. I think it was in the 80s, when he said, when we're done with them, when we have settled all the land, all the Arabs will be able to do is to run around like drugged cockroaches in a bottle. And I kept thinking about that, because it's kind of what I was seeing. People were weary. I mean, they were carrying. Did I lose you? Sorry.
Nope, you're here.
Oh yeah, sorry. I mean, people, especially when they had to flee. I mean, I would see, groups of people just. I went to meet a friend of mine who was fleeing from a village called Khuza'a, which is in the eastern part of Gaza, that was being bombed, and it was her 5th time fleeing, and they were carrying. They've been carrying their lives with them everywhere they went, and she's a psychologist, and she has 4 children with her. Her husband is disabled, and they slept in the street, and they had such this weariness, this exhaustion, and almost everybody there is kind of waiting for death to come, and I think they're fighting for their children, and for the instinct to live. But when they sit down and talk about it, it's just, they think the ones who've been martyred are the lucky ones. It is so horrific. And it is such, it's so degrading and insulting. And to hear people now talk about October the 7th like the worst atrocity, while we have for the past year been watching, brains spilling out of the heads of babies and bodies in conditions one cannot fathom. I was on I did a show this morning on India TV, and all the horrible adjectives are reserved for October 7th. And I want to say too that nobody really knows. I refuse to comment on October 7th at this point until we actually know what happened. What we do know is that there was a prison break by people who have endured unspeakable carnage for at least 75 years, and who have been under a siege for nearly 2 decades, and which has rightfully been called a concentration camp, and who have been slaughtered in the mowing the lawn campaigns. I know you've talked about that before. And we also know that their aim was to target soldiers and military installations. We also know that 28 Israeli Apache helicopters were dispatched, and that they emptied all of their munitions and reloaded at least once, and that all of the scorched fires in homes were done by Israeli fire, not Palestinians who don't have that kind of firepower. We know from eyewitness testimonies that a lot of Israelis were shot by their own soldiers, by live rounds, by tank rounds, and by Apache rounds. So until there's an independent investigation, and we also know that Israel lied repeatedly. The beheaded babies, the burned babies, the eviscerated pregnant woman, the mass rape, the severed breasts. I mean, all of these, every single one has turned out to be a massive lie. So I would like to know what happened on October 7th, and I feel like there should be an independent investigation. In the meantime, we know Israel has beheaded babies. We know that they are that this is the largest population of pediatric amputees, of pediatric deaths. It's the largest cohort of targeted journalists, of healthcare workers being killed. It's extraordinary. They are breaking all the records of historic carnage, and everybody, and Western, I shouldn't say everybody, it's Western media primarily, all they want to talk about is October 7th, because our lives do not matter. We are, whether Western media will admit it or not, our deaths and murder and misery is acceptable. It's you know, it's worth it, as Madeleine Albright said.
My God. So I'm glad you said that, and you all have both touched on an interesting point. Susan, you framed this as a prison break, which absolutely makes sense in the context of Gaza being an open air prison and the level of siege, even concentration camp conditions that we've seen there. Norm, I've interviewed you myself, and we've talked about the relationship sort of between what happened on October 7th and sort of Nat Turner's rebellions historically, and sort of how we can make certain kinds of political but also moral judgments on Hamas's decision and other affiliate groups to resist an unlivable set of conditions. So I just want to talk a little bit more about that. Sort of how did we get here? I'm incredibly frustrated that the media, the Western media, believes that history began on October 7th, and that the history of Israel-Palestine begins on October 7th. So I want to talk about October 6th and before. To each of you, I'm going to start with you, Norm. Sort of, how did we get here? What are the Hamas didn't wake up one day on October 7th and decide to pick up arms. This is a process. Talk to me about that journey, that process.
Always in these questions, there's the point of departure. Where do you start? I will just start where I think is probably the best place, the right place, which is 1948, where Gaza became Gaza. In the course of the 1948 war, the estimates are about 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from the area that became the State of Israel. About up to 300,000 of those expellees ended up in Gaza, and they overwhelmed the population that lived there. So at this point, about 80% of Gazans are either refugees from 1948 or descendants of refugees from 1948, still classified as refugees. And the population of Gaza has, from the beginning, resisted its fate. And there were periodic guerrilla attacks from Gaza, but really wasn't mostly guerrilla attacks from 1949 to 52, 53. Overwhelmingly, the Gazans were just trying to return home. They were what the historian Benny Morris calls economic infiltrees, Infiltres, economic. They wanted to return home. They wanted to cultivate their fields. They wanted to see their old friends and neighbors in Israel. And when 1956 happens, is when Israel, the UK, and France invade Egypt, they took over Gaza, the Israelis. And when they took over Gaza, they committed these really gruesome massacres, literally hundreds of Gazan men were just lined up and shot dead in places. Now the names are familiar to the world. In places like Khan Yunis and Rafah, there were several hundred Palestinians who were simply Gazan Palestinians who were simply slaughtered. In 1967, when Israel takes over Gaza and the West Bank, uh, there was also resistance, and Ariel Sharon, who was a figure in that era, not known anymore to young people, but had a reputation for extreme brutality. He was known as the Butcher of Beirut. In 1970, he entered Gaza and committed these quite horrible atrocities and large-scale population displacements. By 1991, when the first Intifada began, Israel began what came to be called the closure policy. And the closure policy was effectively to seal off Gaza from the West Bank and seal off Gaza from the world. I would want to know, even before I go there, because a lot of people, I can understand it. I don't have a problem trying to understand people who I think are acting out of good faith. A lot of people recoil at the term concentration camp to describe Gaza. It's interesting, already as far back as 1955, when Egypt controlled Gaza, this is before Israel, already in 1955, the main UN representative in Gaza, his name was E.L.M. Burns, he described Gaza as a concentration camp. You come to 1967, Al Gore, our Al Gore, who was vice president, ran for president, his father visited Gaza either in June or July 1967. I can't remember which month. And he said Gaza is a concentration camp. That's how he described it. Now, I'm less concerned here about the technical accuracy, whether it's by Oxford English Dictionary, it qualifies as a concentration camp or not. By Oxford's dictionary, I believe it does, but let's just leave that aside. What's striking to me is concentration camp was already a known term in 1955.
Right.
By 1967, it was strongly associated with the Nazi Holocaust. But everybody who goes there, the first image that leaps to mind when they see Gaza, the first image is a concentration camp. And I should think if that's the image that leaps to every witness's eye, there must be something about that reality that calls to one's imagination the term concentration camp. As I said, by 1991, Israel embarked called a closure policy, which is to effectively seal off Gaza from the West Bank and from the world. Fast forwarding to 2006, there's an entity called the Palestinian Authority, which has administrative responsibilities for maintaining the occupation, for maintaining Israel's occupation. The Palestinian Authority, exactly as you would imagine under those circumstances, they're acting as Israel's surrogates. They are hopelessly corrupt and incompetent. And so there were parliamentary elections in 2006, ironically enough, imposed by the United States. President Bush at the time called for what was called at the time democracy promotion. And one of the areas he wanted to quote unquote promote democracy was the West Bank and Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territories. He called for elections. Hamas didn't want to participate because they saw the elections as part of what they call the Oslo process, namely legitimizing the Israeli control. But they were exhorted. They participated, and to their surprise, they won. They won the parliamentary election. Immediately as they won, the US, the EU, and Israel, of course, imposes brutal economic blockade on Gaza. in order to impose so much misery on the people of Gaza that they would overthrow the Hamas government. That's a standard tactic. Everybody knows it. I go as far back and further than when the socialist government came into power in Chile in 1973. The policy of Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time, he says that we're going to, and this is the literal words he used, you can just look it up, it's everywhere. He said, we're going to turn the screws on Chile until the economy screams. Until the economy screams, meaning impose so much misery in Chile that they will overthrow the Allende government, which they did. And so the same tact, which is what you might call tactic, which you can call standard operating procedure, was now imposed on Gaza. And they imposed what was called a humanitarian minimum diet. Humanitarian minimum diet was basically a starvation plus diet. And that meant they literally, not figuratively, they counted the calories of the people in Gaza so as to ensure they won't cause a mass famine. They would keep them alive, but with a minimum caloric intake. And between the blockade and the periodic Israeli high-tech killing sprees in Gaza, what Israel calls its operations, or more colloquially, what it calls the mowing of the lawns in Gaza. The basic fact is, by October 6th, 2023, the day before the event being commemorated today, the people of Gaza, overwhelmingly the militants who breached the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they had been born into a concentration camp. They were left to languish in a concentration camp, and their fate was to die in a concentration camp. And on October 7th, remember at that point, on October 6th, Gaza had completely vanished from the world stage. All the talk was about the Abraham Accords and whether or not, if and when, Saudi Arabia would become part of the Abraham Accords. So all of the diplomacy at the time was occurring over the heads of the people of Gaza, who would be left to languish and die. On October 7th, Hamas attempted what you might call a roll of the dice. Namely, they wanted to shatter the status quo. Decent, reasonable people can disagree. I don't agree with Susan Abulhawa. I do believe we have enough information about what happened on October 7th. We have the UN report from Navi Pillay. We have the Human Rights Watch report. They're quite detailed. And one of the aspects of the report, which makes it pretty compelling, is a lot of the evidence came from Hamas. A lot of it came from the videos they took of what was happening on those days. I believe, and I said it to a friend, he's now a senior member of Hamas, but we used to correspond, just correspond. His name is Bassem Naim, or Naim Bassem, or Bassem Naim. A very smart guy. He's got two PhDs, and he's sort of the main spokesperson for Hamas. And we used to correspond in the past. And I said to him after October 7th, I said, Bassem, don't bother denying what happened. Something horrible happened. Don't bother denying it. Do what the abolitionists did. They didn't deny what happened with the Nat Turner Rebellion. They didn't deny it. It was horrible, no question about it. What they did was to say We told you so. That's what the abolitionists kept saying. We talking to white people. We told you so. You treat people this way. You treat people this way. You treat people this way. Don't react in shock and indignation when they do what any human being in those circumstances would have done.
It's an interesting moral question, Susan. I want you to jump in because I have a few things to ask you. I mean, there's a way to think about it that way. Like, I told you so. People will do these horrible things if you keep them in horrible conditions. But then there's another position that many people have taken, which is to say, by virtue of them being placed in these horrible conditions, the act itself isn't horrific or horrible, right? That Hamas has a moral right to defend itself and to use violence, and that those people who are occupying that space, even so-called innocent people or civilians, by virtue of being in a military, in an illegal settlement, or by virtue of being there, are themselves not innocent in the way that we would imagine, someone to be, any more than a white person in a slaveholding state might be. So there are different. I'm just saying there are different positions to take about this, even around the morality of it. And I think so much of the discourse has been either Palestinians saying Hamas was wrong, or Palestinians being asked to say Hamas was wrong, or to deny Hamas. And there hasn't been enough space in my mind to at least have an interesting conversation about what it means to think about resistance as righteous. So I just want to talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, I am never to condemn Hamas. I'm not one of those people, and I disagree with Norm, obviously, because, and I don't think Norm knows the answer to this. I mean, if we don't know how many people Israel actually killed, how many of their own people, and until now, that entire number, the 1,200 people, which is, it's actually 1,139. It's not 1,200. They rounded up. Right. But of those, we don't, all of those are attributed to Hamas. That Hamas murdered them all, and that's patently untrue, and we really don't know the number. And I would like to know, and I would like to see an independent investigation into that. But I can feel individual compassion and sympathy for the women and children in the big house on the plantation, but I am always going to root for Nat Turner and the people with him. I can feel individual compassion for the white women and children, settlers or homesteaders, as they were called, who were scalped. But I will always root for indigenous warriors. I will always root for Crazy Horse and Chief Sitting Bull, because I know who the victims are. And I know that these people, while they perceive themselves as innocent, and in some ways they themselves may be victims of a system that's using them for imperial expansion, they are not innocent. It doesn't mean they have to die, but the innocence that is always ascribed to Israelis is just one of the dehumanizing factors against Palestinians, because we are never allowed to be, not even our babies are innocent. Everything we go through, no matter how horrific, no matter how barbaric, no matter how much we bleed, no matter how much we try to conform to the way that they need us to be, we are never innocent. And everything they do to us is justified, or it's blamed on us. So I refuse. And if you look, for example, U.S. media was celebrating this pager attack on 4,000 people simultaneously. Because why? Because the vast majority of those pagers, according to them, belonged to Hezbollah, members of Hezbollah. It didn't matter that they were in their homes, or that they were in shopping malls or in markets, or driving their cars, whatever. Their mere association with a resistance organization made them and everybody around them guilty. And yet, every single person at that Nova Festival, by virtue of their age, was either an active duty military soldier or a reservist. Every single one. And yet nobody ever talks of them as being legitimate targets. Nobody questions their innocence. They are always referred to as civilians, even though they're not. These are also the same. Everybody who lives around Gaza is a colonizer. And in fact, every single one of these kibbutzes is located on a former Palestinian village that belongs to people who live in Gaza. All of these people are also, they're the same people who would sit on the hilltops surrounding Gaza, bring their sofas and popcorn, and watch as Israel bombed and set Gaza on fire in their mowing the lawn campaigns. So, and again, this doesn't mean they need to die, but I reject this absolute innocence that's always ascribed to the people who, they know they're. If I live in an area that requires military protection, and it's across from a concentration camp, and I'm bringing my kids to that place, I mean, I bear some responsibility. I'm not going to a place like that.
Susan, talk to me a little bit about Palestinian resistance throughout these different eras. Another thing that I found somewhat troubling is when people hear Palestinian resistance, they only hear Hamas or even just the PLO, again, both of which are legitimate resistance and liberation organizations. But there's also the Great March of Return. There's also general strikes. I mean, there's just been so many forms of Palestinian resistance throughout history. None of which seem to change the West's response, and certainly not Israel's response. Sort of, what's that like to sort of, one, to think about those different types of resistance, but also to find that none of it seems to work?
Well, right, and nobody knows about it because the only time they ever hear about us is when Israelis are harmed, right? Like prior to the formation of the PLO, from 1948 until the 1960s. The late 60s, Palestinians weren't quiet. We were going from one court to another, from one country to another, pleading our case, going through whatever procedures people asked us to do. Nobody even knew we existed, and it was only when Palestinians started hijacking planes and engaging in guerrilla warfare that the world even deigned to admit we existed. And then there was this whole several decades later that where Israel just continued this barbaric colonization, imperialism by the inch is what I call it. The daily grind of land theft, of home demolitions, of night raids, of checkpoints, and all of that, and deaths and murders, constant, and administrative detention and imprisonment, and all of that goes unnoticed until there's the first Intifada, which was largely nonviolent. I mean, the worst that Palestinians did were these like ninja nails that they threw in the streets to bust up their tires of their vehicles, and then so that then they take notice, and then that movement, that popular uprising, is then subdued with the Oslo Accords, which, just like these endless ceasefire negotiations, they were meant just to buy time so Israel could continue what it wants to do, which is to continue trying to obliterate us, trying to destroy us, and to acquire more land and more resources. And this is not, it's just not complicated. It's the oldest story in the book. And going back to Nat Turner, this is another narrative of a people who think that God loves them more, who think that they arrive with providence and divine entitlement to take, to loot, to destroy, to kill, because they are better, they are more civilized, they are more loved by God. They have providence. I mean, it's just, and then if when the natives actually protest or fight back, we are savages, we are terrorists, we, and so the story goes. But what's so shocking is that this is happening in the 21st century, and in an era that purports to, in a world order rather, that purports to value international law and human rights, and democratic ideals and whatnot. And so in that way, Israel is a complete anachronism, and there's no way to reconcile their existence with everything that the West claims to uphold. And so there's this clash, and the media is playing the most important role of bridging that gap by lying and spinning and dehumanizing us, and creating this aura of innocence and self-defense around Israel.
Norm, I know you have some time constraints, so I want to go to you. I have two questions for you. The first one, and then I'm going to steal Susan for a little bit to talk about these U.S. elections and what it means to vote for empire. We're going to go there. But Norm, my question for you is partly around the rebuilding of Gaza. You talked earlier about the sort of destruction of the infrastructure. I've been doing some research for a paper, and I've been paying particular attention to the destruction of schools. And I think we're up to 87% of school buildings have been damaged or destroyed. All 12 universities have been destroyed, not to mention all the other killing of students, teachers, etc. We see the destruction of museums and mosques and all these things, right? It's not just what some have called spatiocide, but it's also a certain commitment to what some have called urbicide, or the destruction of a city, not just the physical built environment, but the things that make a city, the things that comprise civil society, all that gone. And as you mentioned, an unimaginable amount of rubble. And now the Israeli state, as you argue, has a kind of a claim, a disingenuous one, but a claim for why it can't be rebuilt, why you can't have cement, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By that, when I hear all of that, it sounds like Gaza can't be rebuilt, but there are still, even if we take the most liberal estimates of the death rates, and we say, let's say 300, 400,000 Palestinians have been killed, and it might be 500,000 by the end, God forbid, right? We're still talking about 1.7 million people in Gaza without civil infrastructure. What does that look like?
I think that's an important question. First of all, the aim was to obliterate Gaza. That's why the attacks on the hospitals were so important to Israel, because a hospital represents, it's symbolic of the most fragile display, embodiment of civilization. And when in any human rights covenant, anyone, there's always special protection for hospitals. Hospitals have a unique status as the most fragile reed, you might call it, of civilization. And when Israel targeted the hospitals, it was transmitting the message that we are obliterating every aspect of Gaza's civilization. There is no safe space in Gaza, not just in terms of the physical survival of Gaza, but in terms of its civilizational status. We're going after the hospitals, the universities, everything that represents the civilization of Gaza. As to what will happen My guess, obviously, it's purely speculative. As you know, population movements are vast in the world today, not least in the Middle East. There are 2.5 million Syrians in Turkey. There are 1.5 million Syrians in Lebanon. So the entire population of Gaza, let's round it off, assuming, we'll take away the people who have left, the deaths, it'll be about 2 million. And my belief, obviously it's speculation, is faced with the prospect that Gaza cannot be rebuilt because of the rubble, which will take 10 to 15 years to clear, and can't be rebuilt because Israel won't allow in cement, which is what happened after Protective Edge. It's forgotten that when the Mavi Marmara humanitarian convoy went to Gaza, it carried 10,000 tons of humanitarian aid. Most of it was cement because Israel wasn't allowing in cement after Operation Cast Lead to rebuild Gaza. So the idea of not allowing in cement is not something novel, but this time Israel will have the wonderful pretext of the Hamas tunnels, which in my opinion, I can't prove it, I think it's been vastly exaggerated. Sinwar said there were 300 miles of tunnels. Already, I think that's nonsense. And then the Israel started to say 450 miles of tunnels, which of course the New York Times immediately reprinted as fact. If the whole New York City subway system, and Mark, you know our subway system, the total number of tunnels is 430 miles.
Right.
So you're telling me that Gaza had a more complex tunnel system than the New York City subways? No, that doesn't sound plausible to me. But they're going to use that as a pretext for saying Hamas is going to steal the cement and build more tunnels, and it's going to be an existential threat to Israel. So I can't see how it will be rebuilt. I think by hook or by crook, Gazans will find their way out. And
but to where, Norm? I mean, it's one thing when you talk.
Yeah, as I said, nobody even asks the question to where when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, to where when it comes to Syrian refugees. We're talking about a world where there are just vast refugee movements. Even in the case of Gaza, Egypt has not allowed more than 60,000 Gazans to stay at any given time. So if about 200,000, the estimates are between 150 to 200,000 have gotten out, that would mean probably about 150,000 have already found a way to another part of the world. I can't give you the logistics. That just seems to me how this is going to end. And it's not going to be a happy ending, in my opinion. It's not, I don't want to be a bearer of bad news, but I also believe that the most important thing when an event like this happens is you have to learn lessons. You have to have clarity, otherwise you can't move forward. So I don't think illusions are useful. The African leader Amilcar Cabral, he was the leader of this tiny liberation movement in Africa called the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. He's a forgotten figure, but he said he once gave a speech, and the speech resonated for me. The title of the speech was "Tell No Lies, Claim No Easy Victories." Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And as I said, that I internalized that. We don't want rhetoric. We don't want bluster. There's quite enough of that. We don't need more of it. Tell no lies, claim no easy victories. And we have to be clear-headed about what happened And I think a civilization has been destroyed. And then how do we proceed? And I don't have an answer to that because I have no idea how this is going to end even. So we can't really talk about how to proceed.
Fair enough. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I know you have to run. I appreciate it.
I don't want to give the impression that, I know Susan's going to talk. I'm very happy and eager to listen to her, but I had a prior appointment and I have to stick to it. So thank you both.
No, we're going to see each other soon in London, I think. So let's talk.
I'm a little confused about that, so we should talk about it because I got just an email today and it seems I had the wrong date. So we'll talk.
Y'all talk,
okay.
Yeah, for sure.
And I would like to just end by saying, Susan, that a lot of what you say, I agree with. I don't have a problem with it, and I think just two things, I'm gone and you can, talk behind my back I know. I would say two things. I would say that when we start straying too far from basic humanitarian principles, collapsing the distinctions between civilian and combatant, when we start to stray too far, I think we start getting into very, let's just call it problematic territory. I agree the distinctions aren't always right. I agree that the distinctions aren't applied fairly, even-handedly, but I think we have to always be cautious about straying too far from them because we don't want to legitimize things which humanity attempted to curb, unsuccessfully for sure, but attempted to curb. I would say personally, the thing I hate most when I hear reportage from Gaza, which just today I was reading 45 wonderful doctors put out a wonderful statement, but I can't stand when I hear people refer to women and children as if they're the only innocents in Gaza. What about men?
No.
Yeah, what about men? Aren't they?
I agree with you.
The standard human rights distinction has always been between combatants versus civilians. But suddenly,
except the Middle East, because think about what we did with the Taliban. It's like if you're brown and 16 and out, and you're a combatant just by virtue.
Yeah. And so suddenly with Gaza, they've collapsed the distinction. They've replaced the standard distinction between combatants and civilians. Now it's between women and children and men. And so men have become a legitimate target in Gaza. So that too, to me, is a regression from basic humanitarian standards. And we should say, no, I'm not using, as the expression is, women and children as a proxy for civilians. No, men are civilians too. And the other thing I would say, Susan, is remember, Hamas itself denied that they targeted civilians. They said we did not target civilians. They claimed, various permutations and combinations. They said it was the third wave of non-Hamas, militants. They were responsible for.
Hamas said mistakes were made. They said that we targeted we targeted only combatants, but mistakes were made. That's what Hamas said.
Right, but my point is, even they acknowledge the distinction between combatants and civilians. So they don't reject that distinction. So I don't think we should be more pious than the Pope.
I don't think I rejected that distinction either, but I do reject this total innocence of all Israelis, no matter what, which the media promulgates.
I agree with that.
Say too that some of this sort of be careful where you stray. This kind of language is what they used to say to Malcolm X too. It's that we always have to watch our language We who've had our hearts carved out over and over have to watch what we say. And
I think you misunderstood me. I don't care about the language. I said the consequences. The consequences of completely disregarding the distinction between civilians and combatants. It can end up in a very ugly place. I don't care much.
So if I understand you correctly, just for clarity's sake, you're saying that if we accept that all Israelis are at some level complicit and culpable, and there is no distinction between civilians and non-civilians, then you're saying that could create a kind of a slippery slope in terms of how we navigate. Okay.
Yeah, but I want to make sure that, but I want to be clear, that's not what I was saying. But even
I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen to you tonight. I promise. I listen to more.
Norman, you run. I don't want you to miss your appointment.
Yeah, I'm late.
Bye, Norman. Bye.
Bye.
I'll drop Norm out of here to make it easy for him. Let's see. Norm has to log into another Zoom within the next 10 minutes. It's really just one button, but I totally understand. I'm the same way with tech stuff sometimes. But finish your thought, because I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, there were people who immediately said, people like Norm, who said Hamas violated international law. They violated the rules of war. These are war crimes. I am inclined to agree with that position. It's just as a matter of law. And I'm never easy bombing a place where there are 8-year-olds, for example. I'm not saying that's even what Hamas' intention. Yeah, that's what I'm not talking about. I'm not speaking about Hamas right now. I'm speaking in general terms.
Yeah.
I'm saying, like, whoever the entity is, I'm always uneasy when indisputably innocent people are killed. Israel's a complicated entity, and there is an argument that, well, I mean, in terms of how we think about what defines an innocent by international legal standards, by international human rights standards, many of those people would say that what happened on October 7th was a violation of rules. Other people say, though, if you're on an illegal settlement, that is a military. You are a combatant just by virtue of being there, and that's another position. And so I don't have an opinion on who's right and who's wrong as much as I want to learn more about sort of how people are thinking about this. How do you approach something like that?
Let's use an analogy that's relevant to the United States. So some guests who used to come into the big house, right? Are they innocent, or do they have some culpability, right? Yeah. Are they? They're just going to visit some friends, right? Who happen to live on a plantation that enslaves, a few thousand human beings.
Right.
They're just minding their business, bringing their kids, coming to have dinner. Are they do they bear any responsibility? Are they participating in this utterly horrendous, egregious system? Are the you know what I mean? I guess
that's where it gets tough. Also, because that was the argument for 9/11, though, right? Is that as Americans, because we vote for these awful imperialist policies, that none of us are innocent, and so if we happen to die, that we're not blameless, and we're not blameless. But the question is, how blameless do you have to be to not deserve?
No, I hear you, and this is a discussion that one can have. But what I resent is that this is the main discussion that we keep having. This is the main thing that Palestinians have to keep explaining over and over, even while we are living through the unspeakable that's happening to us. I don't give a shit. I just don't anymore. I just don't. It is what I saw in Gaza just is in my DNA. It is so close to the surface, Mark. It's just, and now I see it in Lebanon. None of us are okay. And then to come and have to talk about, like, fuck Israelis. I don't care about them anymore. I'm sick of the way that their lives are just centered and prioritized. And meanwhile, we are just bleeding. We're hemorrhaging. So no, I don't care. I don't care to watch my language. I don't care.
Yeah, I agree. There's no room for respectability here. There's no room for civility, because it doesn't work. It doesn't change anything. Like, to your point about black folk here or anywhere, it's like oppressed people have never gotten anything by being civil, by being polite,
Yeah,
by asking nicely, by
exactly.
being patient.
Yeah,
None
I don't
of
get.
that. So,
And interestingly, I remember Norman telling a story about his late parents, who, I think he said something like, "My mother would not have cared if every German were to be obliterated,
yep,
innocent or not, right?
yep,
She's allowed, right? But we have to distinguish to the minutia. We have to argue and justify every nuance about Israelis, not just about their lives, but about their feelings on campus. We have to protect their feelings, lest we say the wrong thing in defense of genocide, in opposition to genocide, rather, in defense of our people who are being genocided. Like, it is just, and I think, I would encourage Palestinians to stop playing these games, to stop catering to this. We have every right to be angry, to be outraged, to say what we want to say and what we feel. I don't care about Israeli feelings. I don't care that they need to feel secure, because they should not feel secure as long as they are killing us, as long as they make everybody around them unsafe. And that's what Israel is doing. And I also reject the premise that what Israel is doing right now is because of October 7th. It is not. Israel, for 20 years at least, has been talking about this. They have
yeah.
this has been part of their public discourse in political spheres, in academic spheres, in social spheres, and even in entertainment spheres and the media. They have been talking about the Palestinian so-called demographic threat and what to do about it. Because why? Because we're having too many babies, and our babies are a threat to their numbers. And they have been talking about how to transfer us, how to basically, and also genocide us, how to get rid of us. So, this has been a plan, and they've wanted to take Lebanon forever also. And even, I
Right.
mean, you saw that headline in the Jerusalem Post: is Lebanon part of our promised land? Like, this is an
That was wild to
expansionist
me.
set.
They're
But
like, it's like they're saying the
this
quiet
is
parts out
how.
loud. Like, we've always known it, but it's like the quiet parts are being said out loud now.
But it's the thing is that it hasn't been quiet. We've been hearing it. We've been hearing it for decades, and we know what they say. It's just that the Western media and Western populations have not taken notice. But we've been hearing this. We've been hearing this since the 1940s, actually, that God promised them that this is, and it's yeah. So it should come as no surprise. It has nothing to do with October 7th. It has everything to do with this expansionism, and increasingly Israel is being steered by the most extreme messianic elements of their society, and that's the trend. There's no reason to think that is going to be reversed. Then there's every reason to think that's going to be intensified. And what this messianic way of thinking says is that in order for their Messiah to return, they have to settle all of the land, which includes Lebanon, it includes parts of Iraq, all of Jordan, parts of Syria, parts of Saudi Arabia. They have to settle that, and then they have to rebuild their temple. And and the third thing, they have to genocide the Amalek, basically all of us. This is what they think. This is the lunacy logic that is steering our planet. Basically, they're taking this planet off a cliff. In essence, this isn't going to stop in Gaza. Obviously, we said that. We even said it's Gaza, then the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria's next. You'll see, and then Jordan. Yeah. It doesn't stop, and everything we've said is happening.
Absolutely. So before we go, I want to ask you one more question. It's a big question and a small question. We're entering an election season. There's lots of things on the ballot. We should be thinking about Congress. We should be thinking about local elections. But when we talk about the presidential election, Kamala Harris is on the ticket. Jill Stein's on the ticket. Claudia De La Cruz is on the ticket. Cornel West is on the ticket. And Donald Trump is on the ticket. I'm going to assume everybody watching here who I give a fuck about is not voting for Donald Trump. So I'm not even going to engage that part of it. What do we do? I heard Kamala Harris 3 days ago say, and it troubled me to no end, when she talked about Iran being the destabilizing force in the Middle East. She said a million things that are disturbing, But that was like the last thing for me. It's like after watching the last year, to say that Iran is the destabilizing force in the Middle East was wild to me.
Did that surprise you?
Not at all.
You?
Not at all. Nothing she does surprise me.
Yeah.
Nothing she does. She has from day one been, and when I say day one, I don't mean running for president. I mean since Attorney General to DA to Attorney General to Senate to. I mean she is. Yeah. Only slightly less, and when I say slightly, I mean it's largely rhetorical. Only slightly less aggressively Zionist than Joe Biden, right? And
I wouldn't even go that far.
Yeah, and I said it might, and I'm saying it might just be rhetorical because he actually says I'm a Zionist and she doesn't. That's the only difference I see. And so for me, and you and I need to talk offline about this at some point. I know you reached out, and I didn't see it because I had COVID, but I'm struggling with this election. I have no intention of ever endorsing Kamala Harris. It's never on my agenda, right? But the question I've had is, when I watched what Trump did during his time, I watched him cancel the UNRWA funds, not even with the pretext. I watched him, not do the normal punt that all presidents do on the embassy move. I've watched him sort of have this bromance with Netanyahu. I genuinely believe, as awful as Biden has been, and I don't think that Biden could have been any worse. I think more Palestinians might die under Trump than under Biden, than under Kamala Harris. This is my premise. That's my pretext, right? That's my premise.
Yeah.
And I also take seriously the need I'm a lifelong Green Party member, to think about what it means to, at the moral level, I don't want to make a vote for genocide. I wouldn't sleep well at night doing that. But I also won't sleep well if I make a vote that I think makes things worse. So I'm struggling with what to do. It's not, do I endorse Kamala or not? It's sort of, and I have my own issues with the Green Party right now, politically, that I've talked about publicly with them. So there's a lot of things on the table for me, but as my audience is watching this, I know a lot of them are equally conflicted. They're like, yo, I can't vote for genocide, but I don't want to vote for Trump. There's the Supreme Court, there's women's reproductive, there's all these other things that would be potentially different. I don't want to be a single issue voter, but I don't want to sell Palestinians out. I don't expect Palestinians to vote anywhere differently. But so these are all the mixed parts that I have, and I'd love you to help me think through this a little bit.
I'm glad we're having this discussion. I wish we had more time for it because I think these are important things that people are grappling with and should talk through. For Palestinians, I think the best we can do at this hour is to register our just dissent by voting for a third party. I am going to vote for Jill Stein because I believe in moments like this that it's a disservice to us, to people everywhere, to vote in a way that caters to this lesser of two evil shackles that we willingly carry. It's a choice. We choose to accept this lesser of two evil logic, and therefore it is. Because if people did not accept it, it would not be a reality. So I reject it, and I choose my morals. I choose my principles, and that's the only way I sleep at night. I don't think Harris is better than Trump on anything. I really don't. And I know there are perceptions out. No, I don't. I mean, and you'll see, if the Democrats get into office, one of the first things, and because there have been rumblings about this, and if you listen, so there was a headline the other day of John Kerry saying, if we can get the Democrats in, there are legal ways to basically curtail the First Amendment to quote unquote prevent disinformation. Wow. And so after you read that headline and then you go back and listen to some of the things that Kamala Harris has been saying and others have been saying, you realize that they're literally starting to condition us to this idea that the First Amendment needs to be modified somehow to accommodate this digital age of fake news, because they are bothered by the fact that ordinary people have access to information that does not go through gatekeepers, the traditional gatekeepers. So that's going to come under the Democrats. There's there's some ways that Trump is even better than Harris, and there's maybe some ways that she's better than him. But on the whole, I don't think either is better than the other. Trump is, he's insane. He's horrible in every way. But he's also someone who did not. He's an isolationist, and he doesn't. He'll stop funding. He'll allow Israel to annex this or that, but he doesn't strike me as someone who even understands the international arena to participate.
That's what scares me. That's what scares me.
But which means that he's not inclined to participate in wars, right?
Unless he brings John Bolton on again, who likes to bomb everything. The thing is, he's a useful idiot for
there are so many factors. There's so many factors, and the truth is, no matter whether it's Harris and listen, I think Kamala Harris is a neocon hawk, and it's no accident that Dick Cheney is endorsing her. I mean, that alone should tell you something. That Dick Cheney, of all people, isn't he along with a whole cohort of neocon hawks like him are endorsing Kamala. And it's for a reason. It's not because they just love her, but yeah. So, I think we are screwed no matter what. So right. Therefore, I choose to vote on principle, and I choose to use this vote with a longer term sort of thought process. I'm not just thinking about this election because there's really nothing we can do. It's one of two devils, and I reject that. I reject the devils. I reject this evil. I reject this. I reject what they're doing to us because
I think I struggle because of the Supreme Court and some of these other things that I think do make a market difference down the road. But I pose this question, maybe it's not a fair question, but if Kamala Harris were different, right? Let's say she said, I'm for an immediate arms embargo, for an immediate no more funding. I'm no longer going to exercise veto power for the Security Council. I'm going to work toward a Palestinian state that the Palestinian civil society supports. Let's say she had as good a position on Palestine as any Democrat could have, but she had the same reprehensible position on Congo and Haiti and Yemen and Saudi. Mm-hmm. Would you vote for her?
First of all, that's a hypothetical that would never exist because people who would hold that, because Congo is not disconnected from Palestine, is not disconnected from Yemen. So that's we don't live in a hypothetical world, and I know that would never exist. But the point.
See, for some people it does. I think in the minds of some of my audience it does, because they're like, Kamala is shit on the Middle Eastern front. She's a warmonger and a hawk. But I think I'll have the right to an abortion. I think I'll have a right to affirmative action. I think I'll have a right to, maybe a living wage job under her versus Trump. And so for me, that is not me personally, but for that voter, that is the comparison that there's some domestic shit that we're dealing with as a trans person, as a disabled person, etc. That absolutely will be that she's on point for, or at least is respectable on. And then there's this other thing that's indefensible, but I can't ignore these things either. That's the challenge.
So don't forget, she's been in office, not the president's office, but she's been part of the administration for the past 4 years. So if there hasn't been any movement under the Democrats on these things, I don't know why people think it's going to be different the next time. I mean, at the end of the day, people have to, they vote what they think is right. But these issues are not disconnected. And there's not going to be, I don't know why people think that, taking, at this point, trillions of dollars out of the economy to support, these imperial wars don't affect things domestically. So, Kamala Harris, if she's already said she's going to continue funding all of these wars and continue bolstering Ukraine and now Taiwan for a confrontation with China potentially, and Israel. Walt said it. He supports Israel expansionism. So this is going to go on. And who's footing the bill? What do you think is left for us? You really, Like, none of these are disconnected. I mean, look at what's happening in North Carolina. Oh, this is under Biden. Do you think Kamala Harris has nothing to say about that?
Yeah.
She's making
No.
that choice. She has a voice in this decision, and she's showing you what kind of president she's going to be domestically. And if she's in office, I'm going to be happy to say I told you so, because all of these things people think she's going to be wonderful on, she's already demonstrated a pretty bad record on. And also, like, here's another thing. People, for some reason, when awful things on the domestic front are happening under the Democrats, whether it's family separation, deportations, somehow they disappear from people's minds and nobody's talking about them, even though they're happening.
Very true.
And
that's the one argument for Trump that there is a way, and Angela Davis and I talked about this last week at a public event, like where you want to pick your enemy. And I think Kamala is someone who can be moved in a way that Trump isn't. That was her position. She said, I think Kamala is a person who at least we can wage war against. Trump, there's no room. But then there's a way that I remember being in the streets in 2004, marching, or 2002, 2003, marching against what was happening in Iraq. And we were in DC and students were out and you know, it was just amazing to watch the kind of anti-war sentiment. And then once 2008 came and it was Obama's drones and Obama's war machine,
exactly.
Suddenly everyone was like, "Oh, it's different." It's like, no, it's not. It's literally not
because
different.
It's a black. Right, exactly. And
it's a black person, it's a Democrat, it's a liberal, all this, right?
Yeah. And the reason, and it's not really because they're a Democrat or that he's black or whatever. It's because the media is playing a central role in this, the liberal media in particular, and so they sort of all these things continue to happen under the Democrats, but they disappear them from public consciousness and public imagination, and people are not mobilized. At least under Trump, you will see mass mobilization and mass participation in the political life, which I think is ultimately a good thing. I think you know, getting the, which is part of what I'm talking about, like long-term outlook for this country. It's, you know, regardless of what you think of Trump, it's only going to be under him that people are mobilized for the same issues that would be happening under the Democrats. But because they're under him, people are going to go in the streets because they're going to be visible in the media. And it's always a good thing when you have popular political mobilization, because this system does everything to keep people at home, to keep them marginalized politically, to disenfranchise them, to keep them, you know, busy trying to just make ends meet, busy trying to distract them with celebrity culture or sports culture, whatever, anything except public participation in political life. And that will happen under Trump. And domestic issues are, because most Americans, it's a large portion of us who really focus and understand the relevance of foreign policy, but most Americans don't know and don't care.
They don't care.
But they do care about domestic issues. So, you know, and because of that, I don't worry. There's a self-correcting mechanism for domestic issues in the United States that will be activated if those things are under threat. Now, you know, I mean, the world, we're moving towards a fascist status, and that's been happening under you know, for many administrations, whether they're Democrat or Republican, because frankly,
they're all right wing at this point.
Exactly, because there's a layer of people, there's a layer of elites in this country who are really pulling the strings, and you know, there's corporate interests, there's billionaires, there's massive donors, and you know, we do that. I mean, this country has legalized bribery that they called lobbying and whatnot. I mean, and at the end of the day, they don't listen to us unless we vote them out, unless we, you know, protest them. And to me, that's what I can do. I have this singular vote, and I'll put that vote firmly on the foundation of my morals.
I respect that.
And
I
that's
respect
it.
that. And I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. It's just, again, I struggle because, you know, when I'm in different spaces, I'm talking to different kinds of people, and there's different needs and different urgencies that people communicate. And I want to do the most principled thing and the thing that'll help us get free. And I'm not sure that we'll ever get free playing, you know, as you said, lesser of two evils. But there's always this moment, and this has happened my entire life, again, as a Green Party person, where everybody says, yeah, you can do that except this election because the sky is falling this election. This time, you can do it normally, but not with Bush. You can do it normally, but not with Trump, right? There's always a boogeyman.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
And that's a legitimate challenge. But there is a way that Trump is different.
I want to go back.
We have to run, but I'll give you the last word, please. I want you to get your last thought.
To that hypothetical that, you know, that would never exist. I think a more apt sort of hypothetical would be, would I vote for Harris if she was all the right things on Palestine, but she was also very clear that she wanted to put all Black people in bondage again, because that was a better world, because that's how intense genocide is. And my answer would be no, I would not vote for her. Because I have moral clarity on that.
Yeah.
So that's the apt analogy.
That's helpful. If we have more time, I push back on that comparison, but you should come back because I want to talk just about this election stuff and about sort of how we can think about really continuing to push this anti-war movement that we've been a part of for a very long time, and fight the corporate Democrats and find a way to deal with the immediate pressures people are feeling right here. Because the conversation we're having, you know, when I go into Black communities, brown communities, queer communities, they're having a different conversation sometimes. And sometimes it's because, as you pointed out, we don't have the political education to see the relationship between the domestic and the international. But then sometimes I think I'm being tone deaf to some people's urgent needs. And I don't know which is which sometimes. But what I know for sure is that there's no universe where anything that the Democratic Party has done on this issue and so many other issues is defensible, or, you know, it can't be explained away, it can't be defended, it shouldn't never be endorsed. And so we got to talk through that. Anyway, Susan, I know this is an incredibly long and painful, challenging day. I'm grateful to you for spending some time with us. Also, I want to just shout out Playgrounds for Palestine, because that is such an important organization. It's such an important organization that you started, and you and a community of really committed people decided that, you know, this work needs to be done. I encourage everyone to go to the Playgrounds for Palestine website to make a donation. In fact, it's my time for my annual donation. All the proceeds from Except for Palestine go to Playgrounds for Palestine. So I'll be sending you a check again as soon as I get it from them.
Mark. We're
of course,
actually all of our resources now are going to support a school in Gaza. So we're not doing playgrounds. We're doing a school. So just FYI. Yeah.
That's I'm glad you said that, and that's so important. So everybody just check that out. We'll again, hopefully Susan can come back on and we can talk just about that work, because those efforts are so important, especially right now with scholasticide happening there alongside all the other sides that the Israeli apartheid state is committing there. Anyway, Susan, thanks for joining me. I'll talk to you again soon.
Take care.
Love you. Everybody, thank you for watching Night School. This has been an incredibly helpful and powerful conversation. I'm so grateful to Susan Abulhawa and for Norman Finkelstein for joining me today. I'm so grateful to you all for watching it. We're 1 year in and we're still fighting. We're going to keep a spotlight on Gaza. We're going to keep a spotlight on Lebanon. We're going to keep a spotlight on Sudan and Haiti and all these other places. We're only going to grow in our purview as time goes on. I'm grateful to you all for watching it tonight. And I ask that you all continue to support the work we do here on the channel. Please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. We need to keep Gaza and Palestine more broadly in the news. That only happens if you hit the like on this content and if you hit the subscribe button on this content. Also, family, hit the join button if you can. You're watching this on YouTube, hit the join button. If you're watching it elsewhere, go in the description, find the link, and hit the join button. When you hit the join button, you become part of the monthly financial support of the channel, which again is incredibly important. We can't do this work. We can't fight corporate media. We can't tell these stories without your support. So please hit the join button. Also consider now, many of you joined a year ago, please consider, if you're a bronze member, please consider moving to silver. If you're a silver member, please consider moving up to gold. If everyone were to move up one level, we'd have the financial stability we need to do the war on Haiti report, to do the war on Sudan report. We need the support and we need the resources to make all of that happen. Please understand, I'm not here pocketing money and getting rich off this. This is purely to keep the work going, to advance the work. Also, many of you are watching and asking how you can support if you don't want to make the monthly commitment. The answer is to go to Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle. If you're having a Cash App problem, we've been in a fight with Cash App because they're trying to take too much money from us. But try the Cash App. If it doesn't work, PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle. If everybody watching right now were to donate $10, we would meet our financial goals for the month. If everybody watching right now were to donate $10, we'd be able to keep night school going, office hours, coffee and books, the classroom in the cell, to have the special reports, to expand what we're doing, to pay our employees, to keep the content going, and to build a new studio to do even more work. $10 right now for the month would be amazing. Cash App, PayPal, Venmo, Zelle. But if you don't have 10, you can leave $1. If you have more than 10, you can leave $1 million. Anything in the middle, we're grateful for. But $10 is the magic number tonight. Everybody, thank you for watching Night School. I can't wait to see you again tomorrow. We'll talk soon. Peace.